Welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is a soft reimagining of The Ugly Duckling, a story of quiet becoming, of moving through loneliness and change, and of discovering, in time, the shape of who you were always meant to be. So settle in and let the story begin. It was high summer in the country, when the fields seemed to rest in their own abundance, and even the wind moved with a kind of leisure, passing first over the wheat that were the color of warm bread, then through strips of green oats, and at last into the low meadows where the hay had been cut and stacked in sweet-smelling rises. Beyond the open fields there were woods deep enough to keep their own coolness, and among them lay still ponds dark beneath the leaves. Near one such pond stood an old manor house, weathered and broad, with a moat running round its walls. Along the bank, where the water took the shadows of the house and the trees into itself, burdock leaves had grown so tall and thick that they made a little world of their own. In that leafy shelter, half hidden from the yard and the path, a duck sat on her nest. She had sat there so long that the days had begun to lose their edges. Morning light slid down the leaves, noon pressed warm upon them, evening brought the softer hum of gnats, and still she remained, patient beyond cheerfulness now, for patience had become simply the shape of her life. From time to time another duck came by to ask how matters stood, though no one ever stayed very long. The water in the moat was more amusing than conversation under the burdock leaf, and everyone had some opinion without wishing to share the burden of waiting. At last, one quiet afternoon, the first shell gave way with a small, neat crack. A damp yellow head appeared, then another and another. Tiny bills opened for the light for the very first time. The new ducklings blinked at the green roof of the leaves above them and the green glow all around, as if the whole world had been laid out in one kindly color. Their mother stretched her neck over them with sudden tenderness and brisk authority all at once. "Quack, quack," she said. "Now let us see what sort of children you are." The little ones stumbled out from among the shells and peered at everything with solemn astonishment. They were soft and bright and surprisingly well set together, and the mother duck, though she would not say so in a boastful way, thought them handsome. Only one egg remained unbroken at the edge of the nest. It was larger than the others, and it had required more warmth, more time, and a degree of faith that had become inconvenient. She settled herself again with a sigh. An old duck from the yard came waddling through the leaves soon after, broad of breast and experienced in all matters, whether or not they concerned her. She looked over the lively brood with approval, then fixed one sharp eye upon the lingering egg. "That one has kept you long enough," she observed. "It has indeed," said the mother. "Still, I have sat this far into the season. I may as well see it through." The old duck leaned close, examined the shell, and gave a knowing little click of the bill. "It might be a turkey egg. I once made such a mistake. There is no peace to be had from turkeys. They do not understand the water, and what is the use of a bird who cannot take to water?" The mother duck, who was tired and tender-hearted and unwilling to admit to miscalculation, answered more firmly than she felt. "He may be late, but late is not the same as wrong. I shall sit a little longer." "Then sit," said the old duck. "Only do not say I failed to warn you." She went away again, and the leaves closed behind her. The next morning the large egg cracked at last. The shell opened slowly, as if what was within it had no wish to hurry into the world. Out tumbled a duckling, unlike the others, larger, longer-necked, covered in a grayish down rather than yellow, with an awkwardness that seemed to begin at one end of him and continue all the way to the other. His mother stared. He blinked back at her, still wet from the shell, still scarcely gathered into himself. "Well," she said after a moment, because something had to be said, "you are certainly a sizable child." The small ducklings clustered near her feet, neat and golden as polished grain. The new one stood apart, only because there was no room where they stood. The mother duck looked from one to the other, her brow, if ducks may be said to have such things, nearly furrowed. "You do not resemble the rest," she said quietly. "Your resemblance is not everything. We shall see how you take to the water." That was the test. It always had been. So when the day warmed and the moat lay blue-green beneath the burdock leaves, she led them down through the bankside grasses to the edge of the water. Without more ceremony than occasion deserved, she stepped in. The ducklings followed in a little line of splashes. One after another, they vanished beneath the surface and bobbed up again as the water had only returned them to themselves. Their feet began working at once. They floated, they turned, they belonged. The large gray duckling, after the smallest pause, leaped in too. For an instant, his mother watched with tension in every feather. Then he rose as cleanly as any of them, steadier even, his body carried by water in a long, smooth line. He paddled as if he had been waiting all his life for this. The mother duck's whole manner softened. "There now," she said, with an air of vindication that pleased her greatly. "No turkey ever moved like that. He is mine after all." The gray duckling didn't know that he had just passed from suspicion into a limited sort of acceptance. He knew only that the cool embrace of the moat, the light trembling on the surface, and the strange gladness of having found one place where he was not too large, too small, or too much. In water, everything seemed to fit more easily. His mother gathered them round her again. "Come along," she said. "It is time you were introduced to the duckyard. Keep close, mind the cat, and whatever else you do, carry yourselves properly." The leaves swayed above them as they went, and beyond the shade the wide farmyard waited, noisy and sunlit, full of creatures who had opinions ready before they had looked closely at anything at all. The duckyard stood in a bustle of feathers, muddied straw, spilled grain, and old arrangements no one thought to question. There were hens who kept to their own corners, and cocks who announced themselves from barrels and fence posts as if each morning had been created solely to hear them. A turkey strutted in the heat with such gravity that one might have mistaken him for a magistrate if not for the foolishness in his eye. Ducks moved in company or complaint. Geese passed with self-importance. Cats observed from thresholds. Human footsteps came and went, always meaning to feed, fetch, or drive something elsewhere. Into this society, the mother duck led her children. They had scarcely crossed the yard when they found the place in commotion over the head of an eel. 2 families disputed it loudly. Several others offered advice. And in the end, the cat carried it off with composure, as if the whole argument had been staged for his convenience. The mother duck clicked her bill and told her brood that this was the way of the world, though she herself had looked with some longing at the vanished prize. "Now," she said, recovering her dignity, "stretch your necks, turn your feet properly. There sits the old duck with the red rag on her leg. She is of consequence, and you must show respect." The ducklings obeyed as they could. The small yellow ones made a pleasant enough impression. The down was fresh, their beaks tidy, their feet appropriately splayed, and their mother began to feel that perhaps the difficult season had ended, and a respectable brood, after all. Then the gray duckling stepped into clearer view. A murmur ran through the yard with almost cheerful quickness. What a curious thing! Did that come from her nest? He is too big. He is ill-shaped. He looks as if he's been put together in twilight. The words came from ducks, hens, and creatures no less concerned than any of them. A sharp-beaked duck darted forward and nipped him on the neck. "Let him alone," said his mother. "He has the look of being wrong," said the other duck, untroubled. "There's no kindness to pretend otherwise." The old duck with the rag considered the family, letting her gaze pass over the neat ones with satisfaction before coming to rest upon the largest. "The others are passable," she said. "That one is unfortunate." The mother duck preened the gray duckling's shoulder, as if smoothing him might settle the question. "He is not handsome," she admitted, "but he swims well, and I believe he has strength. Time may improve him." Time, however, did not begin its work in the yard with any gentleness. The gray duckling found that every path narrowed when he came upon it. The grain scattered around him faster than for others. If he stood still, someone shoved him. If he moved away, someone followed. The hens pecked his legs for being where their scratching took them. The duck bit when he passed too near their puddles, and the turkey made a ceremony of charging him, swelling and stamping as though he were defending the honor of the whole farmyard from a personal insult. Laughter, if such a sound can be carried in clucks and gobbles and harsh barnyard voices, followed him everywhere. At first, he tried to remain near his mother. She still spoke for him sometimes. "He means no harm. He is only young. Give him room." Yet even her patience frayed. She loved order, and order did not know what to do with this child who attracted disturbance merely by existing. His brothers and sisters, anxious to prove themselves well-made and properly born, drew away from him with growing eagerness. They learned quickly what pleased the others. "I wish the cat would take him," said one under his breath. Another, less brave, repeated it louder when the others were near. The gray duckling heard such things without knowing how to answer them. What argument can be made against being seen and disliked in the same breath? He tried standing in quiet corners. He tried making himself smaller. He tried moving with more care. Nothing altered. Wherever he went, his size seemed offensive, his color a mistake, his face a joke understood by everyone but himself. There were moments when he forgot. At the edge of the moat, if he slipped into the water before the others came, he felt the old ease return. There, at least, movement belonged to him. He could glide between reflected leaves. He could dip his head beneath the cool surface and come up bright-eyed and quiet. The water asked no question of appearance, but every return to land brought him back to judgment. Days passed. Summer deepened. Dust rose from the yard into the afternoons and settled on the feathers of those who had no pond within easy reach. The gray duckling grew, as young creatures do, in spite of unhappiness. Growth didn't help him. It only made his difference harder to ignore. One morning, the girl who fed the poultry came through the yard in wooden shoes, scattering grain from a pail. The ducklings crowded round, peeping and pushing. The gray duckling came too, hungry as any of them. When he pressed near, the girl turned and struck out her foot, not hard enough to injure, only sharply enough to send him stumbling back into the mud while the others carried on eating. No one objected. A few seemed amused. Something gave way in him then, not his courage, for he'd never been granted enough ease to grow proud of it, but the last weak thread that tied him to hope of belonging there finally broke. That evening he stood apart beneath the hedge, hearing the yard settle into the ordinary sounds, wings shaken out before sleep, low muttering from the hens, the scrape of claws on the perch wood, the frogs beginning beyond the moat. His mother had tucked his brothers and sisters beneath their feathers, and there was no space for him, that didn't feel borrowed. The moon rose pale over the fields. The air smelled of damp earth and cut hay gone sweet with age. Somewhere in the bushes, the small birds shifted in their sleep. He looked once toward the nest he had come from, though he could no longer imagine fitting under those leaves, then turned towards the fence. It was higher than he ever meant to fly. Fear put a chill into his body, but another feeling moved beside it, quieter and steadier. The sense that staying would wear him away more surely than any uncertain road. So he ran, his wings still awkward and half-trusted, opened. He cleared the fence badly, caught himself, and went on through the weeds on the other side. Little birds started from the hedge in a fright. They fly because of me, he thought, the old conclusion rising at once. Yet he kept running. He crossed the rough road beyond the yard, through grasses silvered by moonlight, past ditches where frogs stopped and stared, until the last of the farm sounds fell away behind him. Ahead lay marshland, open and dim, with reeds standing thick at the edges and water dark between them. There he dropped at last among the rushes, worn through with weariness. The night closed softly over the marsh. No one came to peck him. No one laughed. Wind moved through the reed tops with a sound like low whispering, and the gray duckling, alone at last, and uncertain what aloneness would bring, laid his head beneath his wing and waited for morning. Morning came by degrees over the marsh, loosening a pale silver light across the reeds before the sun itself appeared. Mist clung low over the water, lifting and drifting in thin veils whenever a breeze touched it. The gray duckling woke stiff from the ground and sore with the memory of flight, but the quiet around him was another kind of quiet of the yard. Here, silence was not withholding itself. It simply belonged to the place. He slipped into the marsh water and drank. For a short while he hoped that perhaps this would be enough, that a creature might keep to the reeds, take water when he needed it, keep his head low, and be left to pass his days without trouble. But before the light had fully warmed, several wild ducks came gliding through the channels between the rushes and stopped to stare at him. They were not cruel in the manner of the yard. Their judgment had less excitement in it, which, somehow, made it no softer. "What are you?" one asked. He bowed as politely as he knew. "I do not know that I'm anything worth naming." They circled him once. "You are exceedingly ugly," said another, with the coolness of fact. "Still, that is no affair of ours, so long as you do not marry into the family." Marriage had never entered his mind. Shelter had, and quiet, and a mouthful of water without contest. So he thanked them for their toleration, small as it was, and stayed low among the reeds. They allowed it. For 2 days he lived in that mercy, drinking from the marsh, sleeping among the rushes, speaking to no one unless spoken to. On the 3rd day, 2 young wild ganders came by, handsome in their own opinion, and buoyed by the thought that youth itself was a distinction. They had newly learned the world and believed this qualified them to instruct it. "You there," called one, splashing closer. "You are a remarkable sight." His companion laughed. "Remarkable enough to be remembered. Come away with us. There's another marsh nearby, and in it some very fine young geese. Your appearance will astonish them." The gray duckling scarcely understood whether they mocked him or invited him. For their manner, the two things were braided together. Before he could answer, a sharp tearing sound broke across the water. Then another. One gander flung up his wings and fell. The other gave one startled cry and collapsed into the reeds. Red spread through the shallow water around them. At once, the whole marsh erupted. Wings beat upward from every side. More shots came, close and hard. Smoke lifted blue between the willow trunks and the edge of the swamp. Men had hidden themselves there before dawn, and now dogs splashed in from the banks, driving through the rushes and muddy shallows, noses down, bodies eager and terrible. The gray duckling flattened himself in the thickest reeds he could find. Water trembled around him from the force of the bodies plunging past. A great dog thrust his head almost over him, breath hot, teeth bright, eyes fierce with purpose. For one long instant, the duckling believed everything had ended. But the dog only sniffed, hesitated, and went on. When it had gone, the duckling shook so badly that the water rippled. I am so ugly, he thought, in dazed relief, that even the dog will not have me. He kept still for hours after the shooting ceased. The marsh held no peace now. Broken reeds drifted, feathers clung to blood-dark water. Far away came human voices, then the fading crack of one last shot. Evening drew in slowly, and with it, a wind from the open fields. At last, he rose and fled. He went without direction, driven by fear more than choice, across meadows already roughened with the late-season growth, and through plowed strips where the earth clung heavy to his feet. The wind freshened as daylight fell, turning cold and insistent. By the time the first stars showed, it had become a storm wind, pushing at him from one side so strongly that he had to lean his whole little body against it. Rain had not yet begun, but it seemed folded somewhere inside the dark. Then, in the failing light, he saw a hovel. It crouched low against the field, warped with age and weather, so crooked in its frame that it looked undecided whether to stand or sink. One hinge on the door had given way, and the plank hung askew, leaving a narrow opening. The wind drove through it with a whistle, but there was warmth beyond, or something nearer to warmth than the open ground could offer. The duckling squeezed through. Inside the hovel lived an old woman, a cat, and a hen. The room was small and smelt of peat smoke, stale meal, and the close domestic air of creatures accustomed to one another. The old woman, who saw poorly, sat nodding in her chair near the fire. The cat lay curled in authority near the hearth. The hen occupied a basket lined with straw, and had the composed expression of one who contributes regularly to the household and is fully aware of it. In the morning, the newcomers discovered him. The cat arched its back and purred in a low, rich roll. The hen clucked at once, sharply, and tilted her head. The old woman peered through her dimness and declared it a fortunate thing that a duck had come to her door of its own accord. "If it is female," she said, "there may be eggs from it yet." So the gray duckling was permitted to stay while the matter was tested. 3 weeks passed. No eggs appeared. This settled the position in the house more plainly than any introduction could have done. The cat, whose name was Sunny, considered himself master there because he could arch his spine, purr with elegance, and produce sparks from his fur when rubbed the wrong way. The hen, Chickie Shortleg, believed herself mistress because she laid eggs faithfully and saw no accomplishment equal to it. The old woman loved them both according to their usefulness, which each of them thought wholly just. They often spoke of we and the world, by which they meant themselves first, and everything beyond the hovel only insofar as it confirmed their opinions. The duckling listened from his corner. At first he was grateful for the roof, the fire, the dish of food set down without debate. Yet gratitude did not quiet the old longing. Through the cracked door he could smell damp earth after evening dew. Through the little window he could see weather moving across the fields. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he caught the scent of open water and felt in his whole body the memory of swimming. One gray afternoon, he said as much aloud. "I should like to be in the water again." The hen stopped pecking at once. "To what purpose?" "It's hard to say," he answered, "only that it feels right to float and dip beneath and come up again." She stared at him in disbelief so sincere it almost amounted to pity. "Have you nothing better to wish for? Lay an egg? Purr? Make yourself useful? That is how one becomes content." The cat opened one eye. "Can you arch your back?" "No." "Can you purr?" "No." "Can you make sparks?" "No." "Then do not oppose settled wisdom." The duckling lowered his head. "You do not understand." "We understand perfectly well," said the hen. "You are dissatisfied because you have too much time for nonsense." The room seemed smaller as she spoke. Firelight thickened by the shadows. The air smelled of ash and old straw. Outside, beyond the warped door and the low roof, and the narrow knowledge of this place, the wide world stretched with all its coldness and uncertainty. Yet in that moment, uncertainty seemed kinder than confinement. "I think," he said softly, "that I must go out into the world again." The hen tucked one wing and turned away. "As you please." So when dawn came, pale and thin among the threshold, he stepped once more through the crooked door and left the hovel behind him. The world outside had changed while he sat in the hovel fire. Summer's breath had narrowed. The fields were no longer rich in the same generous way, but touched here and there by a quiet wearing away. Leaves along the wood's edge had gone yellow at their rims. The reeds moved under a sharper wind. Light no longer lingered so late, and evening came with a chill that found its way quickly beneath the feathers, not yet fully grown. Still, he preferred it. He found ponds where he could swim if no one else claimed them first, ditches where the water lay brown beneath grasses, and lonely stretches of marsh where a gray bird among the shadows was scarcely worth notice. Wherever he went, some creature sooner or later marked him for what he seemed to be: odd, oversized, ill-favored. But the encounters were brief, and there was comfort in briefness. To be disliked and left behind was easier than being made the daily object of a whole yard's amusement. Autumn settled more fully over the land. The forest leaves turned from yellow to rust, and from rust to a deep worn brown. They loosened one by one, then in little showers, and the wind took them spinning over the water, laying them in shallows where they darkened and sank. Crows gathered on the fence rails in the mornings and called hoarsely into the cold. Low clouds moved heavily across the sky, and once or twice sleet rattled through the reeds before melting where it fell. The duckling grew with the season. His body lengthened, his wings strengthened, and though he still thought of himself as the same rejected creature who had crossed the fence in moonlight, there were changes happening in him that he could not yet read. His flight, when he tried it, no longer felt entirely accidental. He could rise from the water with purpose now, circle, and come down again in a sweep that surprised him. It was not the beauty he felt, for beauty belonged to other creatures, but some new force was gathering in his bones. Then one evening, when the sun was low and the west lay full of quiet gold, he saw them. They came out of the reed beds at a distance, pale shapes against the dim blue stretch of the water. Then they lifted, and at last light struck them all at once. White wings opened, long necks reached forward. Their bodies shone with a brightness that was not the brightness of gulls or farmyard geese or anything he had ever known. There was height in them, and ease, and a grave loveliness that seemed to belong to the sky and the water equally. Their cry, when it came down over the marsh, was unlike any voice he had ever heard before. Wild and mellow, mournful and glad in the same breath. He stood still in the shallow water and watched them rise. They turned southward toward warmer countries, toward open lakes that winter would not close. The fading light gathered along the edges of their wings until they seemed to carry evening with them. Higher and higher they went, and he craned his neck upward until it ached. Something stirred inside him then, deep and unsettled, like a memory he didn't possess. It was longing, but unlike the longing he had felt at the hovel for the common pleasure of swimming, this reached further. It widened him and troubled him and filled him with a sadness so piercing and so sweet that he could scarcely bear it. Without knowing why, he cried out. The sound that left him was thin and strange and so unlike the voices around him that he startled himself. The swans didn't hear, or if they did hear, they had already gone too far into the evening. He watched until there was nothing left of them but whiteness fading into distance. Then, nothing at all. After that, he could not forget them. He dreamed of white wings moving over dark water. He dreamed of a place where such birds might descend and not be driven off, where reeds bent to them and streams held their reflections clear. When he woke, the marsh was still marsh, cold and brown-edged, and he was himself. Yet the sight of those birds had left its mark. He loved them for reasons he could not name, and did not envy them, because envy asked one to imagine possession, and he could no more imagine being like them than he could imagine becoming sunlight or wind. The cold sharpened. With each day, the water skin thickened sooner in the night and held longer in the morning. He learned to keep to the deeper parts of the pond, where the surface remained open. When frost came silver over the grass, he swam steadily to keep a space from closing around him. The hole in the ice grew smaller despite his effort. Each dawn it had tightened. Each night he paddled harder, his feet numbing in the black water, his breath quick with exertion. One evening, the wind failed altogether, and the cold that followed was worse for its stillness. The stars glittered as if the whole sky had frozen too. By morning, the opening around him had drawn closed around a narrow ring. He pushed, turned, paddled, struck at the edges with his body, but the ice answered only with a dry, cracking sound and would not give. His strength spent by days of struggle ran out quietly. He made one last effort, then drifted against the hard rim of the frozen pond and became fixed there, held fast by winter. He might have also died, and the reeds would have whispered over the snow above him, and spring would have found him only as a shape beneath clear ice. But a farmer passed that way early, his wooden shoes ringing on the frozen path. Seeing the trapped bird, he came out to the pond, broke the ice around him, and lifted him free. The duckling hung limp in the farmer's hands, scarcely more alive than dead, and was carried beneath a coat flap to a cottage where warmth smoked from the chimney, and children crowded close to every small event, as if it had been arranged for their delight. When he revived, fear rose before reason. The room was full of movement, children reaching, a woman bending, voices too near, firelight, the scent of milk and meal and wet wool. He tried to flee. In his panic, he fluttered straight into the milk pail and sent white splashes across the floor. The woman cried out. He blundered into the butter tub, then into a bin of meal, so that when he burst out again, he wore a mask of flour and drippings and looked more ridiculous than ever. The children laughed and chased him. The woman seized the tongs. Chairs scraped. The room rang with alarm and amusement together. At last, by sheer terror and accident, he found the open door. He flung himself through it and into the snow. There, among bare bushes, where fresh powder had gathered in branches, he lay stunned and shivering. The sky hung low and white above him. Behind the cottage sounds dulled as the door shut once more. Before him, winter spread without mercy. He tucked his head beneath one wing, not from rest, but from the simple wish to hide from all that had happened, and the snow received him in silence. The hardest part of winter cannot be told all at once, because hardship doesn't arrive in one grand motion and then depart. It comes in mornings that begin dark and stay cold, and hunger returning before one has quite forgotten the last hunger, and feet that ache before they touch the ice, and the long gray sameness of days that offer little besides endurance. The duckling passed through such days almost without measuring them. Had anyone asked later where he slept, what he ate, how he kept himself alive, he could scarcely have said more than that he moved when he must, hid when he could, and trusted the season to end, because seasons always had before, though he couldn't imagine how. Snow lay over the fields and drifts that reshaped familiar ground into strange white rises. Ditches disappeared beneath it. The reeds along the marsh stood brittle and pale, their tops rattling in the wind like dry beads. Sometimes the sky cleared and the whole land glittered beneath a hard blue brightness, beautiful and severe. Sometimes clouds lowered into the world seemed made of only whiteness, ash-colored willow trunks, and the dark channels of water that still remained opened, only in a few sheltered places. On the bitterest nights, he took what he could, under the roots or the banks, folding himself tightly and listening to foxes move at the distance and branches crack from frost in the woods. He had no company except memory. At times, the memory was the nest beneath the burdock leaves, warm and green and softly enclosed, though even now carried the sting of what followed. At times it was the hovel, the fire and the cat's purr, which had once seemed oppressive and now appeared almost luxurious against the open cold. But most often, when the sky darkened to violet before evening and the first star trembled above the black branches, he remembered the swans. Their whiteness had grown in his mind until it seemed less like feathers than like light taking form. He didn't know where they had gone. He knew only that they belonged to some order of beauty he had once glimpsed and never could entirely release. Winter thinned him. The roughness of youth began to leave his body in ways he didn't notice because no smooth mirror remained to show him. His neck lengthened. His wings gathered breath. The down that had clung to him from infancy was gradually replaced. Feathers came in, cleaner, firmer, better ordered. He still thought of himself as ugly because he had always been told so, and one may live a long time inside a name given by others. Yet nature, working in secrecy through hunger and weather and time, was shaping him toward what he had been meant to be from the first. Then slowly, almost shyly, winter began to loosen. A pale dripping started at noon from cottage eaves and root-dark banks. The snow crust softened where the sun touched it. Channels in the marsh widened. Once, on the morning of a thin brightness, he heard a sound that he had not realized he had missed, the clear upward note of a lark. It came from somewhere above the fields and altered the air at once. Spring had not arrived, not fully, but it had sent a herald. The change gathered. Water ran beneath the old ice. Willow twigs flushed with the hint of gold. Wind no longer cut so deeply. By the time the last hard frost withdrew from the mornings, the duckling found that when he lifted his wings, they answered him differently than before. There was weight in them, yes, but also power, a sure breath. He tried them once over a narrow stretch of water and crossed farther than he had intended. Startled, he landed badly in the reeds and stood there breathing hard, feeling in his body the possibility of distance. Days later, he tried again. This time, he rose higher. The marsh opened below him in brown and silver bands. Beyond it lay fields paling in green. Further still were orchards beginning to haze with blossom. He didn't plan his course. His wings, wiser now than his thoughts, carried him onward. When at last he descended, it was into a garden so fresh with spring that it seemed to belong to another country entirely. Apple trees stood in bloom, their branches clouded with white and pink blush. Lilac bushes leaned heavy with scented clusters over the winding stream. Grass, newly grown, spread soft and bright between the trunks. The air itself felt young. He drifted beneath the trees in wonder. Then he saw moving upon the stream ahead 3 white birds. At once he knew them for the same kind he had watched in autumn, though now they were near enough for every motion to be seen. The effortless gliding, the slight lifting of wings, the curved necks, the grave still beauty of them. They seemed even more noble at close hand, not because they sought admiration, because they had no need of it. Water received them as if it were proud to do so. Blossom shadows lay over their backs and broke apart with the current. A deep sadness came over him then, but it was not the sadness of winter loneliness. It was gentler and more resolute. He had lived through mockery, chase, hunger, cold, and the constant knowledge of being unwanted. Before him were creatures he loved without hope. If they struck him down for approaching, the loss would still be less bitter than the life he had led apart from anything beautiful. He spread his wings and went toward them. As he drew near, the white birds turned. Their feathers rustled. They came toward him in a silent sweep that might have been welcome or warning. He couldn't tell. The old instinct of fear rose in him, yet he didn't turn away. "Kill me then," he thought, and bowed his head toward the stream. The water beneath him lay still enough to hold an image. And in that clear spring mirror he expected to see what he had always seen, a gray, ill-made creature, too large and wrong for any company. Instead he saw a white, long, bright neck curved over the water. A clean breast rode the current. Broad wings, newly full and shining, rested at his sides. The face looking back at him was not the face of the duckling who had fled the yard. For a moment, he couldn't understand. The stream, the blossom shadows, the 3 swans near him, the sweetness of lilac in the air, everything seemed to wait upon that recognition. Then one of the white birds came close and touched him lightly with its bill. Another glided beside him. The third circled once and settled near, not as a judge or rival, but as companion. He didn't know whether joy could arrive too quietly to be believed, but if it can, it came to him then. It didn't burst or dazzle. It unfolded. All the long, lonely months behind him gathered into meaning without losing their sorrow. He had not become beautiful by wishing it. He had not earned belonging by suffering. He had simply grown into what he had always been, though no one around his beginning had known how to see it. The stream moved softly beneath the lilacs. Above them, bees drifted among the blossoms. Somewhere in the orchard grass, a thrush began to sing. And for the first time in all his life, he was not alone among his own kind. The other swans didn't ask him where he'd come from at once, nor require him to account for his thinness, the roughness still lingering in his manner, or the startled way he seemed to listen for insult where none had yet been offered. They accepted his presence with a grace more healing than any speech. One swam at his side down the curved stream. Another moved ahead and turned back now and then, as if making sure he followed. The third remained near the flowering bank, where fallen petals trembled on the surface like little boats. He stayed with them through the first bright afternoon in a kind of wonder that didn't fully settle into certainty. The world felt changed. though of course the world itself had not changed at all. The stream still ran over the stony bend, the apple trees still leaned in their bloom, a light wind still passed through the lilacs and carried their fragrance into the garden. Yet, to inhabit the same air without fear or ridicule, to feel the water around him and know that the shape he had made upon it was no offense, this altered everything. The swans guided him beyond the narrow stream into a broader piece of water fed by it, a clear pool ringed by grass and low stone. There he saw his reflection again, more steadily now. No trick of light had deceived him. He was white from neck to tail, white not with the brilliant flatness of chalk, but with a living sheen that caught silver where the current moved and a cream where the sunlight touched. His body, once all awkward uncertainty, had lengthened into harmony. Even the posture that had seemed strange in the yard, too upright, too still, too unlike the ducklings around him, belonged, naturally, to this form. He dipped his head, lifted it again, and water jeweled along his bill. One of the older swans gave a low musical note. It was as if she had seen him question it and answer it without words. Yes, you are as you appear. Yes, you may remain. They moved together into evening. As the light softened, the garden grew quieter still. The scent of damp soil rose from the edges of the water. Petals loosened in the orchard and drifted down one by one. The duckling, though already in truth no duckling at all, felt an unfamiliar easing through every part of him. Vigilance relaxed. He no longer measured every movement with the chance of giving offense. When he folded his wings, it was from contentment rather than defeat. Night passed peacefully beneath the overhanging branches, and dawn returned to him, joy before he had time to question it. Soon, the garden children discovered him. They came with crumbs and small aprons and skirts, laughing as children do when the spring has put warmth into the morning and bread into their hands. At first, they saw only the familiar white birds upon the water. Then, the youngest pointed. "There's a new one!" At once the others crowded forward to look. Their voices, bright with pleasure, ran over to the bank and out above the stream. "Yes, a new one. Look there, how lovely he is. The youngest, surely. And the prettiest." They threw crust and cake upon the water. One child clapped her hands. Another ran back toward the house, calling for father and mother to come and see. The swan who had once crouched beneath a hedge while birds flew up because of him could scarcely understand such words spoken in his hearing. Praise sat strangely upon him, not because he desired to reject it, but because he so long expected the opposite. He lowered his head and tucked it partly beneath one wing, overwhelmed by a bashfulness almost tender in its confusion. The other swans received the children's excitement calmly. They had heard such admiring voices before, no doubt, and knew that the world sometimes responds to beauty with delight. But to the new swan, every small kindness was still astonishing. The children's crumbs, the smiling faces of their parents upon the path, the easy drift of welcome around him from the birds and the humans, all of it reached him through the memory of colder things. He remembered the yard. He remembered the sharp bite upon his neck, the laughter from the hens, the girl's wooden shoe driving him back from the grain. He remembered the marsh dog passing him over, the cat and the hen and the hovel speaking of the we and the world, the winter pond tightening around him, the chase through the cottage and the flower, and the milk and the fright. These memories had not vanished merely because spring had come. They lay within him still, but changed now by distance, as frost changes a field when seen from far off. Pain remained pain, yet he could look upon it without being wholly buried by it. He understood something, though not in the solemn way of lessons. Rather, it moved through him like clear water finding its course. The creatures who had mocked him had spoken from ignorance of what he was. He himself had believed them, because young hearts often take the world's first naming as truth. But the truth had been growing in silence all along, under his gray down, through his awkwardness, through exile and weather and loneliness. No pecking could alter it. No contempt could erase it. Even he who had borne the hurt had not been able to hinder it by believing the worst. That afternoon, the swans lifted into flight over the garden and nearby meadow, and he went with them. How different it was now. He had once fled the yard with wings used merely to escape. Now air held him as if it had known him from the beginning. He rose above the blooming orchard, above the stream curving like a ribbon through the fresh grass, above hedges newly leaved and roofs flashing in sunlight after rain. The land spread wide and tender below, fields greening, ponds bright, woods just misting into spring. Beside him, the other swans moved in long white strokes, and his own body answered theirs with a sure elegance he had never dreamed could belong to him. They returned to the water at dusk, when the sky was washed with pale gold and the first coolness returned. No one asked him for a history. No one insisted that he justify his place among them. Yet, in the very silence, he found room to remember himself more kindly. He was no longer merely the creature who had been rejected. He was not the one who had suffered. He was a swan among swans, alive in spring, afloat beneath lilac boughs, and the world, which had once seemed all hedge and fence and narrowing spaces, now opened wider, each day. Still, because a gentle heart does not grow proud simply from hearing admiration, he didn't begin at once to carry himself with grandeur. Humility had been woven into him by harsher hands, but it no longer stooped from shame. It settled inside gratitude. At sunset, when the stream turned rose-colored beneath the blossoms, he stretched his neck and looked at the sky, where the evening birds were crossing homeward. He had never imagined there could be such quiet happiness. Spring ripened around him, and the days took on a fullness very different from the swollen richness of summer in the duckyard. There, warmth had once meant noise, competition, feather dust, and the endless sorting of creatures by place and favor. Here, it meant unfolding. The grass thickened along the banks. The apple blossom that had seemed like a soft cloud began to loosen and drift away. Lilacs deepened, then faded. Irises rose near the stream with blue heads among the reeds. Each change came so naturally that to live among it was to feel time move, not as a burden, but as a widening. The swans left the garden sometimes for other waters and returned again, and before long he came to know the neighboring streams, ponds, and broad lakes where the reeds grew high and water lilies later in the season would open. He learned the habits of early morning mist, the places where fish flickered close to the surface, and still coves where dragonflies hovered, and open stretches where wind laid a dark running pattern over the water. He learned the voices of his companions too, the softer calling at dawn, the deeper notes exchanged in flight, the faint rustle of feathers as they settled side by side for the night. He had lived so long under scrutiny that his new life of simple belonging sometimes startled him afresh. A swan beside him might brush his wing in passing, and the lightness of the touch could move him almost to tears. Another might incline his neck in quiet greeting. Such gestures would have gone unnoticed by creatures who had always received them. To him, they were daily proofs that the world held forms of company gentler than he had first known. There were moments, however, when old habits returned. If a bird on the bank gave a harsh cry, he still sometimes flinched. If children ran suddenly toward the water, his body remembered pursuit before his mind recalled kindness. Once, when a gaggle of farm ducks from a distant yard came waddling to the shore and began muttering among themselves, he moved aside at once, expecting mockery. None came. They gave him one look, saw a swan, and lowered their voices in ordinary respect. It was a small thing, hardly worth remark to any observer. Yet it left him shaken for a while afterward, not from fear, but from the strange realization that the insult he had anticipated now belonged to another life. On warm afternoons he liked to drift beneath alder shade and watch clouds travel between the leaves. Sometimes the water carried back whole fragments of memory. The smell of sun on rushes brought him at once to the marsh of his flight. The creak of a cart or the distant lane returned the farmer with his wooden shoes. A glimpse of burdock on some neglected bank would send him straight back to the old nest, where his mother had waited longer than wisdom advised, and for at least a little while loved him as best she could. He didn't despise those memories now, even the sorrowful ones that had become a part of the deep current under his life. Without the long loneliness, he might not have recognized kindness so clearly. Without the winter, he might not have felt spring enter him with such force. This didn't make suffering desirable. He would not have wished it upon any hatchling under any leaf in any summer field. Yet because it had been his, and because he had survived it had entered his understanding. In early June, when the light lingered almost till night, the swans gathered with others on a broad lake bordered by a meadow, flowers and low willow scrub. There he saw many of his own kind together for the first time. Older birds with measured dignity, younger ones still carrying traces of softness about the head and wing, pairs moving quietly in accord across the shallows. No one questioned him. A few regarded him with earnest, for youth has its own radiance in every species, but their interest was not intrusive. An elder swan, broad-winged and marked with the grave calm of age, drifted near as evening settled over the blue lake. For a while they floated without speech. Then the elder said, in a slow way that swans seemed to have of speaking only what mattered, "You carry your gratitude like one who has been hungry." The young swan looked at the fading light on the water. "I have been hungry." The elder regarded him kindly. "Then you will value abundance without pride." No more was said, and none was needed. Yet the words remained. As summer came nearer, he grew into his strength completely. Flight was no longer an experiment. He could rise with others at dawn and cross from the lake to the stream in one smooth line. He could turn in the air with ease, settle upon the water without spray, and stretch his wings wide enough that the sunlight shone through the feathers at the edges. The body that had once seemed a burden had become a source of freedom. He did not admire himself for any of it in a vain way. Rather, he inhabited it with increasing peace. One morning, the wind carried the smell of cut hay from beyond the meadow, and with it came a memory so vivid that he turned his head at once. Across a hedge and a low pasture stood far off the outline of a farm. Perhaps it wasn't the same. The country held many such places, yards full of hens, geese, ducks, muddy troughs, manor houses with moats overgrown with burdock. Yet something in the set of the roof and the line of the trees beyond it stirred him. For a long moment he watched from the lake edge, half hidden among the reeds. He didn't go nearer. The wish to prove himself, to return to be recognized, hardly touched him at all. That surprised him. Once he had thought happiness would require vindication, that if he ever became anything worthy, he must be seen by those who had despised him. But the feeling had worn away. Their knowledge would not change what had happened, nor improve what he had now. The life before him was too full to spend on the correction of old judgments. So he turned back toward the lake, where his companions were already moving into the water. The sun rose steadily, pouring brightness over the reeds. Frogs clicked from the bank. A fish broke the surface in a clean ring and disappeared. Somewhere behind him, and whatever farmyard memory or distance still held, creatures continued their little competitions and complaints. Ahead, the water widened into morning. He followed the swans out into it, serene as the light itself. By high summer, the lakes and streams had become a world fully known to him, though never exhausted. Water changes daily even when it keeps the same banks, and sky is forever lending its new color. Some mornings the surface shone pale as polished tin beneath a veil of cloud. Some evenings it deepened to bronze, where reeds stood black against the sinking sun. Warm rain darkened the willow roots and filled the shallows with the sweet smell of stirred mud. Dragonflies stitched blue fire over the coves. Water hens slipped between the sedges with nervous dignity. Everywhere there was life moving in its own proper rhythm, unhurried by the need to impress anything else. He loved the stiller hours best. Just after dawn, before the day's heat drew voices from the meadows, the lake lay hushed, enough to hold every reflection whole. In such moments, he would glide through the mist while the first light gathered along his wings, and the world seemed suspended between sleeping and waking. The elder swans often kept near the shore at that hour, their white forms dim among the reeds, while younger birds crossed the open water in soft arcs. The young swan, who had once been called Ugly, felt then a settled joy so gentle it could almost be mistaken for peace itself. Sometimes he thought of his mother. He wondered whether she still sat in some summer shade over the later brood, instructing them briskly, correcting their feet, telling them how to bow before the old duck with the red rag. Perhaps she had forgotten him, as farm creatures often do what brings discomfort and then leaves. Perhaps she remembered only that one season had included a child too large, too gray, too much trouble. Yet he could not think of her without tenderness. She had tried, within the small reach of her own understanding. That reach had not been enough to protect him, but it had once given him a place under her wing, and he kept the memory of that early shelter kindly. The hens and the ducks of the yard came to him less frequently now in thought, and when they did, they seemed distant, almost theatrical in their fussing. Even the old pain had softened around the edges. His life no longer revolved around what had been said to him. It revolved around weather, water, companionship, migration remembered in instinct if not in fact. He had entered a larger order where insult could not follow so easily. Toward the end of summer, the swans made their longer flights. Not yet the great southward passage, but practice for it, and pleasure too. They crossed over fields standing yellow again with grain, over villages where smoke rose blue from chimneys in the evening, over woods turning dark under thunderclouds, over rivers that flashed between poplar lanes. With each journey he felt the old ache from the autumn sighting return, but changed now from longing with hope into anticipation. He was one of those white birds in the sky. Somewhere, months before, a lonely gray creature had watched and loved what he could not imagine becoming. That creature still lived in memory, but he no longer ruled the present. One evening, after a storm had cleared and left the whole western horizon washed in light, the flock settled on a broad pond near a garden where children were gathered, and gathering fallen pairs. Their voices drifted across the water, mingled with the hum of insects and the far sound of a cart on the road. One child, seeing the swans, paused and gave a little cry of pleasure. Another threw a handful of crumbs from the bank. The young swan came near enough to take them. The children admired him at once, as children often admire whatever is fair and near and moving before them in clear water. They spoke of his white feathers, the graceful bend of his neck, the brightness of his eyes. He received their wonder shyly, bowing his head a little, and then drifted back toward the others. The elder swan nearest him said, "You still blush in spirit." He answered with a low note that might have been laughter, "I don't know how else to hear praise." "Then hear it lightly," said the elder. "Beauty is a garment time lends. Kindness is of deeper making." He looked at the quiet water and remembered the dog in the marsh passing him by. the hen telling him he was a numbskull, the children in the winter cottage laughing as he floundered through the milk and meal. Then he remembered, too, the swan who had first touched him, and her bill when he bowed for death. The children in spring crying there was a new one, the patience with which his companions had let him learn joy slowly. "Yes," he said at last, though perhaps only in the silent language of his own heart. "That is true." As summer leaned toward its close, a faint restlessness entered the flock. It was in a way that they watched the sky and the longer glides before taking wing, and the gathering together at evening upon the water. The days remained warm, but now a cool thread ran through them in the morning. The reeds had darkened. Swallows began to mass along the wires near the lanes. Somewhere beyond sight, autumn was preparing again. He didn't fear it as he once would have done. Weather belongs to all creatures, and swans are not exempt from change. But he trusted now in continuance. Cold would come, water would harden in places, skies would thin and brighten and gray again. Yet he need not face these turnings as the forsaken gray outcast of the yard. He would go with others. He would rise into the air in broad wings and follow the old invisible roads his kind had always known. On the last soft evening before the first true hint of autumn, he floated alone for a little while near the stream where lilacs had once overhung the spring water. Their blossoms were gone now. Leaves had thickened and cast a denser shade. The stream carried a few early fallen ones from the orchard. He looked into the current and saw his reflection, still white, still clear, still difficult in some secret way to believe entirely, though he had long since ceased to doubt it. He bowed to that image not in vanity, but in acknowledgement. Then he lifted his head again and turned towards the others, who were gathering where the water widened into the evening light. The first leaves to turn did almost privately, a branch here, a branch there, as if the trees were testing the season before fully committing themselves to it. The mornings cooled enough that the mist lingered longer over the water. In the fields, the harvest stood ready. Threads of spider silk caught between reeds and flashed white in the low sun. The swans began to travel farther, then return, then gather again in greater numbers as the days shortened. The young swan felt the old year circling back toward its beginning, but how different the turning was now. Once autumn had meant loneliness widening around him, marsh water paling under cold skies, the first glimpse of beauty too far above him to touch. Now it meant movement shared, the deepening bond of the flock, the readiness of wing and heart together. He knew at last what the stirring within him had been when he watched the swans depart that long ago evening. Not merely desire, but recognition calling to what yet had not been awakened. The morning of departure arrived under a sky washed clear by night rain. The flock gathered on a broad lake rimmed with reeds gone tawny at the tips. Light spread slowly across the water. One by one, the swans lifted their heads, shook out their feathers, and moved into the open space. There was no loud command, no dramatic signal. The moment came as naturally as the unrolling of daylight. He rose with them. The lake dropped away beneath his wings. Reeds flattened into lines, then blurred into color. The flock drew itself in order around him, white bodies steady against the wind. Each bird held its shared purpose larger than any single will. Below them, the country opened. Fields, woods, winding streams, scattered roofs. Somewhere among those fields, perhaps, lay the manor house with its moat and burdock leaves. Somewhere a duck yard still rang with morning clatter. Somewhere an old hen might be scolding. A cat might be purring by the hearth. A farmer might be setting out on wooden shoes across the frost-silvered ground. He looked at once downward, not searching for any particular place, only receiving the breath of it all. There was no bitterness in him now. The world contained both cruelty and shelter, blindness and kindness, winter and spring. He passed through each and had not remained fixed in the narrowest vision of himself. That was enough. More than enough. They flew for long hours, resting at wide waters, feeding in quiet places, then rising again. The rhythm of migration entered him completely. He began to feel time not as a chain of accidents, but as a pattern, older than sorrow. Morning, wind, cloud, light, hunger, rest, flight. These made a music through which his own life now moved in harmony. At a sheltered lake, on one such evening, children came again to the bank, as children often do whenever water and birds and bread happen to meet. They called out at the sight of the swans, and though he no longer started at human voices, he still turned at the inward reserve which happiness had not erased. One small child pointed directly at him. "That one is the loveliest." The words drifted over the water and were gone, no heavier than thistledown. Yet they touched him because once he had heard the opposite so often it seemed the only language the world possessed. He tucked his head slightly, not from disbelief now, but from the gentle modesty that had grown in him alongside joy. The elder swan, nearest him, gave a low, approving murmur and drifted on. Night settled blue and silver over the lake. The flock slept with heads turned back under wings, bodies rocking softly with the dark water. He slept among them, held in the same quiet. Above, stars emerged one by one. Their reflections trembled in the black surface below, as if sky and lake had met halfway and agreed to share the burden of brightness. Before dawn he woke. The world was not yet visible in full, only suggested. The pale seam of east, the shape of reeds, the hush before birdsong. He slipped a little apart from the sleeping flock and let the water carry him. In that hour between darkness and morning, memory came to him one last time in a long, clear thread. The egg's slow hatch, the stare of his mother, the first easy plunge into water, the yard, the marsh, the shots, the dog, the hovel, the winter ice, the garden stream, the white reflection rising to meet him. Each part remained distinct. None had to be denied for the rest to be true. He understood then, as deeply as he was ever likely to understand anything, that happiness is not made by forgetting what came before. It's made, in part, by being large enough at last to hold it without being broken by it. The suffering had not ennobled him by itself, nor had the beauty rescued him from ever having known grief, but the life before him was richer because he had learned tenderness from deprivation, gratitude from want, and humility from having once believed himself unworthy of love. The east brightened. One bird in the reeds gave the first tentative note of morning. Another answered. The swan stirred. Soon the flock would rise again, and the day's journey would begin. Before that happened, he lifted his wings once, slowly, feeling their breath catch the earliest light. It ran along the feathers in a clear white line. He stretched his neck high and breathed the cool new air. There had been a time when he thought the world ended at the fence of the yard and the cruelty of those within it. There had been a time when he believed himself too ugly even for a dog to bite, too strange for any hearth, too lonely to hope. Now water welcomed him, sky carried him, and company moved around him with quiet trust. When at last the first sun broke over the horizon, he let it touch his face. Then, with a full and grateful heart, he joined the others and flew into the widening morning. And now the water is quiet again. The reeds stand still at the edge of the shore. The evening light has softened across the lake. The lilies have closed. And above, The sky has grown pale and calm, holding the last of the day. What was uncertain has been answered. What was lonely has found its place, and the world in its quiet wisdom has opened gently into belonging. Somewhere beneath the fading sky, white wings move peacefully over the water, and a heart that once knew only coldness and confusion has come at last to rest in its own true shape. So now, you may rest too. Let the lake grow dim around you. Let the reeds whisper softly in the dark. Let the stars appear, one by one, above the still water. And let sleep come gently, without hurry. There is nothing more to prove, nothing more to search for. Only stillness now, only softness, only rest. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You've been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.